Let's go teach the new girls some manners. 3 of them, one hallway, no witnesses left brave enough to follow. They dragged Vivian Callahan into the empty science building, past the dark windows, toward a bathroom where nobody would hear her. Preston Colby had her arm. His 2 friends had the rest. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't beg. She just looked at him, calm as still water, and said 7 words. "Last chance, let go of me right now." Preston laughed. "Or what? You gonna fight all 3 of us?" That was the exact moment he found out. What none of them knew, what nobody on that campus knew, was that the quiet freshman they'd been mocking for weeks had spent 10 years training in her grandmother's backyard. 10 years of discipline, 10 years of patience, 10 years of a promise she'd never once broken. Until tonight. 4 seconds later, 2 of them were on the floor.
Every small town has a story it doesn't tell out loud. This one starts on a Tuesday morning in late August at a college most people have never heard of, Maplewood University. A quiet campus in the Midwest, red brick buildings, old oak trees, the kind of place where everyone thinks they know everyone. They didn't know her yet. They didn't know that the quiet girl unpacking boxes in dorm C had spent 10 years learning something most of them would never understand. Not yet. For now, she was just the new girl, the one who didn't talk much, the one who kept her eyes down in the hallway. Nobody looks twice at a girl like that. That was exactly how she wanted it. Her name was Vivian Callahan. She was 18 years old, 5'4", quiet voice, careful hands. She moved into her dorm room alone. No big goodbye, no tears in the parking lot. Just her 2 suitcases and a duffel bag that clinked faintly when she set it down. Her roommate hadn't arrived yet. Vivian liked that. It gave her time to breathe. She unpacked slowly, folded her shirts into neat stacks, lined up her shoes by the door, set a small photo on her desk. It was an old photo, faded at the edges, a little girl maybe 7 years old, standing in a white uniform. Beside her, an older woman, silver hair pulled back tight, strong hands resting on the little girl's shoulders. Vivian looked at that photo for a long moment. Then she turned it slightly so it faced her bed, not the door. Some things were not for everyone to see. Her roommate arrived just before noon, a tall, energetic girl named Sam with a duffel bag on each shoulder and a mother trailing behind her carrying a lamp shaped like a cactus. "Hi, sorry, we're loud," Sam said, dropping her bags with a laugh. "It's a whole thing. You get used to it." "It's fine," Vivian said, and found somewhat to her own surprise that she meant it. Sam talked fast and moved faster, filling the small room with posters and string lights within an hour. She asked Vivian a dozen questions in the first 10 minutes, where she was from, what she was studying, whether she liked mornings or nights. Vivian answered most of them honestly, if briefly. "You're quiet," Sam said, not unkindly, tacking a photo strip above her own bed. "That's cool, though. I talk enough for 2 people anyway." "I noticed," Vivian said, and Sam laughed again, a real laugh, easy and warm. It was a small thing, a roommate who didn't push, who filled silence without demanding Vivian fill it back, but it made the room feel less like a box of borrowed furniture and more like something close to a home. By 9 the next morning, the dorm hallway was full of noise, suitcases rolling, parents hugging their kids goodbye, someone's speaker playing music too loud for so early in the day. Vivian stepped out into the hallway to find the shared bathroom. That was when she first heard his voice. Loud, confident, the kind of voice that expects a room to go quiet when it speaks. "Move the truck, man. I'm not walking around it." She turned the corner and saw him. Tall, broad shoulders, a gray Maplewood football hoodie even though practice hadn't started yet. He stood in the middle of the hallway like he owned it. 2 other guys stood behind him, laughing at everything he said before he even finished saying it. His name, she would learn later, was Preston Colby, quarterback, junior. Son of the Colby family, the ones whose name was on the new athletic center. Everyone on campus knew that name. Vivian didn't know it yet. She just saw a boy blocking a hallway, making a small, tired freshman drive his moving truck backward twice for no real reason. She said nothing. She kept walking, That was rule number 1. Her grandmother had taught her that rule a long time ago. You don't have to win every hallway. Vivian found her class schedule that afternoon: general biology, intro to psychology, chemistry, college composition, ordinary classes, ordinary Tuesday. She sat in the back of every room, not because she was ashamed of anything. She just liked the back. Fewer eyes on her. In her composition class, the professor asked everyone to introduce themselves: name, hometown, one interesting fact. Most students said something about sports or music or a pet they missed. When it was Vivian's turn, she stood up slowly. My name is Vivian Callahan. I'm from Ashgrove, and I guess I spent a lot of my childhood with my grandmother. That was it. That was all she gave them. A boy 2 rows over snorted quietly, not loud enough to get in trouble, just loud enough for the row around him to hear. Riveting, he muttered. A few people laughed. Vivian sat back down. Her face stayed calm, steady, like water that doesn't ripple no matter what falls into it. She had heard worse than that, much worse. That night she called her grandmother. The phone rang twice before a warm, steady voice picked up. Vivian, how was your first day? It was fine, Grandma, just a lot of new faces. Any of them worth worrying about? Vivian paused. She thought of the boy in the hallway, the one who made a stranger back up his truck twice. Maybe one, she said, but I didn't say anything. There was a small silence on the line, the kind of silence that meant her grandmother was smiling. Good girl, Loretta said. Silence is not the same as weakness, Vivian. Remember that. I remember. You only speak with your hands when there is no other choice left. You understand me? I understand. Then you'll be fine. They talked a little longer, the conversation settling into the easy, familiar rhythm they always fell into after the first few minutes. The kind of rhythm that only exists between 2 people who have spent a decade learning how to listen to each other. About the dorm, about the food, about a woman named Dolores who ran a diner near campus, a place Loretta had heard about from an old friend. Go say hello to her sometime, Loretta said. Good people find good people, even in new towns. Vivian promised she would. Before they hung up, her grandmother added one more thing. And, Vivian, whatever you do there, whatever happens, you do not have to prove anything to anyone. I know, Grandma. I mean it. 10 years of training isn't for showing off. It's for the day you have no other option. Vivian looked at the old photo on her desk, the little girl in the white uniform. I know, she said again, softer this time. I promise. She meant it. She had no idea how soon that promise would be tested. That night, before she fell asleep, her mind drifted back the way it often did to a summer afternoon 11 years earlier. She was 7 years old, barefoot in the grass behind her grandmother's house. The sun was still high, but the air had that gold, heavy feeling of late afternoon. Again? Loretta said, standing a few feet away, arms crossed, watching closely. Vivian's legs were tired. Her arms ached. She had thrown the same simple block 40 times already, and every single time her grandmother had shaken her head. Your elbow drops, Loretta said. When your elbow drops, you lose your shield. I'm tired, Vivian said, more of a whisper than a complaint. Tired is fine, Loretta said. Tired is honest. Sloppy is not. Vivian reset her stance, took a breath, threw the block again. This time Loretta nodded once. There it is, she said. Now you have it forever. They sat together afterward on the back porch steps, sharing a glass of lemonade, condensation dripping down the sides of the glass in the heat. Grandma, Vivian asked, swinging her bare feet against the wooden step, why do we practice so much if I'm never supposed to actually use it? Loretta was quiet for a moment, looking out at the yard, at the small wooden target she had built years earlier from an old fence post. You practice, she said slowly, so that the day you finally need it, your body already knows what to do before your fear has time to argue with it. But what if I never need it? Then you'll have spent your whole life becoming calm, patient, and strong, Loretta said, smiling. That's not wasted time, sweetheart. That's just a good life, whether you ever throw a single punch or not. Vivian remembered leaning her head against her grandmother's shoulder that day, the smell of cut grass and lemonade, feeling for the first time that the hours of practice meant something bigger than winning a fight. They meant becoming someone who didn't need to fight most of the time, someone who could choose. Lying in her dorm room 11 years later, staring at the ceiling, Vivian let that memory settle over her like a blanket. She still didn't know, not really, what kind of choice was waiting for her, but she trusted the way she had trusted her grandmother her whole life, that when the moment came, her body would remember what her fear could not argue with. The next 2 weeks moved the way the first weeks of college always move, fast, then slow, then fast again. Vivian found her rhythm, morning classes, a part-time shift at a diner 3 blocks off campus, evenings spent in a small, mostly empty gym in the basement of her dorm building. Almost nobody used that basement gym. Old mats, a single heavy bag with a crack running down one side, a mirror that hadn't been cleaned in years. Perfect. Vivian went there most nights after her homework was done. She didn't turn on all the lights. She didn't need them. She moved through her forms slowly, precisely, the same movements she had practiced since she was 7 years old in a small backyard dojo behind her grandmother's house. Block, step, turn, strike, breathe. 10 years of that, every single week, rain or shine. Nobody at Maplewood knew any of it. To her professors, she was a quiet, attentive student who always turned in her work early. To her classmates, she was the girl who sat in the back and said almost nothing. To Preston Colby, she wasn't anyone at all yet. That was about to change. The diner where Vivian worked was called the Wagon Wheel. Small place, red vinyl booths, a bell over the door that rang every time someone walked in. The owner had hired Vivian on her second day in town, mostly because she showed up on time and didn't ask for more money than the job was worth. The woman who trained her was named Dolores Whitmore. Dolores was somewhere past 70, silver hair pinned back, hands that moved fast despite the years in them. She had worked at the Wagon Wheel for almost 3 decades. "You're quick," Dolores told her, watching Vivian carry 4 plates at once without dropping a single one. "Quicker than most of the college kids I get in here." "I've had practice," Vivian said simply. "Carrying plates?" "Balance," Dolores laughed at that. A real laugh, warm and a little rough around the edges. "I like you, Vivian Callahan," she said. "You remind me of someone I used to know." Vivian smiled just slightly. She didn't ask who. Some questions you let people answer on their own time, if they want to answer them at all. Over the following week, Vivian and Dolores fell into an easy rhythm. Dolores called out orders, Vivian delivered them. In the slow hours, Dolores told stories about the town, about the diner's history, about her late husband, a man named Walt. "He was a police officer," Dolores said one slow Thursday afternoon, wiping down the counter. 28 years on the force here in Fairbridge. Best man I ever knew. "He sounds like he was very respected," Vivian said. "Oh, he was. Everybody in this town owed that man a favor or two." Dolores smiled, eyes a little distant. "He used to say the same thing about people that I say about pie crust." "What's that?" "You can't judge it until you've seen what's underneath the top layer." Vivian thought about that for a long moment. She thought about the little photo on her desk, about 10 years of training nobody at Maplewood had ever seen. "That's a good way to think about people," she said quietly. "It's the only way," Dolores said. "Most folks never bother to look underneath. That's their loss, not the other person's." It was the following Friday when Preston Colby and his friends first walked into the Wagon Wheel. 3 of them. Preston, in the middle, wearing his gray hoodie again, flanked by 2 friends Vivian recognized from around campus. Wesley, tall and quiet, mostly just laughed at whatever Preston said. Grady, shorter, louder, always trying a little too hard to keep up. They took a booth by the window and immediately started making noise. Loud jokes, loud laughter. The kind of energy that fills a room whether the room wants it or not. Dolores approached their table with her usual warmth. "Evening, boys. What can I get you?" Preston barely looked up from his phone. Burger, fries, and can you actually get it here before next week this time? Dolores's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes tightened just slightly. We'll do our best, sweetheart. Yeah, that's what you said last time, Preston muttered loud enough for the whole booth to hear. Wesley and Grady laughed. Vivian, 3 tables away, heard every word. She kept working, refilled a coffee cup, cleared an empty plate. Her face stayed calm, but she was watching. 15 minutes later, Dolores brought their food out. Her hands, usually so steady, wobbled slightly under the weight of the tray. She was tired. It had been a long shift. As she set Preston's plate down, her hand slipped just enough to knock his soda glass. A small splash landed on the edge of the table. Nowhere near him. Nowhere near his phone. Preston jumped back way exaggerated, dramatic. Are you serious right now? I'm so sorry, hun. Let me grab a towel, Dolores said quickly. This is why they should get younger staff in here, Preston said, not quietly at all. This isn't a nursing home. Grady laughed loudly. Wesley smirked into his own drink. A few other customers glanced over, then quickly looked away. Nobody said anything. That was the part that stayed with Vivian the longest. Not the words themselves, the silence around them. Dolores wiped the table without a word, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the wet spot in front of her like it was the only thing in the room. Vivian set down the tray she was carrying. She walked over. I've got this table, she told Dolores quietly. Go take your break. Dolores looked at her for a moment. Something passed between them, something unspoken. You sure, honey? I'm sure. Dolores nodded and stepped away back toward the kitchen. Vivian turned to the booth. 3 young men looked up at her. Preston still had a smirk on his face from his last joke. Can I get you anything else? Vivian asked. Her voice was calm, even, almost gentle. Yeah, Preston said, looking her up and down. A new waitress who isn't 100 years old. Wesley laughed. Grady laughed harder. Vivian didn't laugh. She looked at Preston for exactly 1 second longer than was comfortable. Not angry. Not afraid. Just steady. She's worked here for almost 30 years, Vivian said quietly. Longer than you've been alive. I think that's worth more respect than you're giving her. The booth went quiet for a second. Preston's smirk faltered just barely before he covered it with a short laugh. Whatever, he said, waving a hand. Just bring more napkins. Vivian nodded once and walked away. She didn't feel proud of herself. She didn't feel like a hero. She just felt like she had done the smallest, most obvious thing a decent person could do. She had no idea that Preston Colby did not forget moments like that. He remembered every single one, and he never let them go unanswered for long. Back on campus, the semester kept moving forward. Vivian's classes settled into a rhythm. She liked her composition professor, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Halloway, who seemed to genuinely enjoy reading what his students wrote. She liked her chemistry lab partner, a nervous but kind sophomore named Priya, who talked fast and laughed easily once she warmed up. She did not particularly enjoy sharing a lecture hall with Preston Colby 3 times a week. It turned out he was in her intro to psychology class. He sat near the front, surrounded by friends, always ready with a joke whenever the professor paused too long. Some of the class found him funny. Some of the class found him exhausting. Almost nobody said anything either way. Vivian sat in the back as always and mostly ignored him. That worked fine for about 10 days. Then came the group project. Professor Ellison, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, assigned the class into groups of 4 for a research presentation on childhood development. The groups were assigned randomly pulled from a spreadsheet, no favorites, no exceptions. Vivian's group included Priya, a quiet boy named Elliot Sawyer, and Preston Colby. When the professor read the names aloud, Vivian felt her stomach tighten slightly. Across the room, she saw Preston roll his eyes at his friends before turning around to look for his new group. He spotted Vivian in the back and smirked. Great, he said, loud enough for her to hear as he walked over. The waitress and I are in the same class. A couple people nearby chuckled. Vivian said nothing. She simply opened her notebook and got ready to work. The project itself moved forward the way most college group projects do, unevenly. Priya did more than her share, organizing their research into neat color-coded notes. Elliot, a quiet freshman with glasses and a nervous habit of tapping his pen, did solid, careful work but rarely spoke up in group discussions. Preston did almost nothing. He showed up to their first meeting 15 minutes late, spent most of it on his phone, and left early for practice. At their second meeting, he didn't show up at all. Vivian ended up rewriting most of his assigned section the night before it was due simply because she didn't want the whole group's grade to suffer for his absence. She didn't complain about it. She just did it quietly, the way she did most things. The presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Vivian, Priya, and Elliot stood at the front of the lecture hall together. Preston strolled in 2 minutes after class started, dropped into a seat near his friends, and gave a small wave, as if that made up for anything. Their group's topic was early childhood attachment styles. Vivian had written the strongest section on secure attachment and long-term resilience, using research she genuinely understood, partly because it echoed something close to her own life. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped forward. Her voice was quiet at first, but steady. Children who grow up with one reliable, consistent adult in their life, she said, often show greater resilience later on, even in difficult circumstances. It's not about having a perfect home. It's about having at least one person who shows up every single time without fail. The room was still. A few students were actually taking notes, which almost never happened during a 9 a.m. class. My research also touched on something called earned security, Vivian continued. That's when a child doesn't start life with an ideal situation, but finds stability later through one strong relationship. Studies show that earned security can be just as protective as attachment formed from birth. Professor Ellison, sitting near the back, nodded slowly, clearly impressed. When Vivian finished, she stepped back, and it was Preston's turn. He walked up with the same easy confidence he always carried, holding a single printed page. He read straight from it, stumbling over 2 words, clearly seeing most of the material for the first time. So attachment styles are like avoidant, anxious, and secure, he said. And basically kids need good parents. That's the main idea. A long, awkward pause followed. Professor Ellison raised an eyebrow. That's the entire summary of your section, Mr. Colby. Basically, yeah, Preston said with a shrug and a small, practiced grin. The grin that usually got him out of trouble. A few students snickered, not entirely unkindly. It was almost funny watching someone so confident be so unprepared. Professor Ellison did not find it funny. I'll be evaluating individual contributions separately for this assignment, she said, making a note. Please see me after class, Mr. Colby. Preston's easy grin dropped for just a second. But Vivian saw it, and so did everyone else in the front 3 rows. For most college students, that moment would have been forgotten by lunchtime, a small embarrassment, nothing worth holding on to. Preston Colby was not most college students. He had spent his entire life being told he was exceptional. Star quarterback since middle school, family name on buildings, teachers who looked the other way, coaches who protected him. A world that had rarely, if ever, told him no. Being unprepared in front of 30 classmates and having a professor call it out directly was not something he was used to feeling. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he decided that feeling was Vivian's fault, not his own lack of preparation. Hers. That afternoon, walking out of class, Wesley caught up beside him. "Dude, that was rough," Wesley said, half laughing. "Shut up," Preston said, but there was no real heat in it, just irritation looking for somewhere to land. Grady jogged up on his other side. "The quiet girl's whole section was like a TED Talk. Kind of embarrassing for you, man." "I said shut up." They walked in silence for a moment. Then Preston spoke again, quieter this time, more to himself than to them. "She thinks she's better than everyone," he muttered. "The diner, now this." Wesley glanced at him. "It's not that deep, man. It's a group project. "It's not about the project," Preston said. His jaw was tight. "It's the way she looks at people. Like she's judging everyone." Neither Wesley nor Grady really understood what he meant. Vivian rarely looked at anyone in a way that could be called judging. If anything, she barely looked at people at all, unless they spoke to her first. But Preston had decided something in the quiet, stubborn way people decide things when their pride has been bruised. He had decided Vivian Callahan needed to be put in her place. He just hadn't decided how yet. Over the following week, small things started happening. Vivian noticed her notebook had gone missing from the group project folder, only to reappear a day later, several pages slightly crumpled, as if it had been sat on or shoved into a bag carelessly. She noticed that in psychology class, whenever she raised her hand to answer a question, a low murmur would ripple through Preston's row of friends, just quiet enough to be deniable, just loud enough to be distracting. She noticed her name being mentioned in conversations that stopped the moment she walked past. None of it was dramatic. None of it, on its own, was even something she could report to anyone. It was death by 1,000 small cuts, the kind of bullying that leaves no obvious mark, the kind that relies entirely on a target staying quiet. Vivian stayed quiet, not because she was afraid, because she was still hoping, in the back of her mind, that it would simply run its course, that Preston would get bored, that college would be big enough for both of them to exist without colliding again. She was wrong about that. One evening, walking back from the library later than usual, Vivian passed a group of students gathered near the quad. She recognized a few faces from her dorm along with Wesley and Grady standing near the edge of the group. Preston was in the middle telling a story, his hands moving animatedly. And she's just standing there like dead serious, giving this whole speech about respecting the 70-year-old waitress, Preston was saying, his voice pitched slightly higher, mocking. Like I attacked the woman or something. It was just fries, man. A ripple of laughter went through the small crowd. Vivian slowed her steps, staying near the edge of the shadows, close enough to hear. She's got this whole vibe, though, Grady added. Like she thinks she's tougher than everybody, never talks, just watches you like she's better than you. She's not tough, Preston said with a short laugh. She's just weird. Quiet kids like her always think silence makes them mysterious. More laughter. Vivian felt her jaw tighten just slightly. Not from anger at being mocked. She had been mocked before plenty of times, and it rarely bothered her. What bothered her was the casual cruelty toward Dolores, the way Preston had turned kindness into a punchline. She almost stepped forward, almost said something. Then she remembered her grandmother's voice, calm and steady on the phone. You don't have to win every hallway. She took a breath, turned quietly, and walked the long way back to her dorm instead. That night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, Vivian thought about home, about the small backyard dojo, about her grandmother's voice, patient and firm, correcting her stance for the 1,000th time. Power without control is just noise, Vivian, Loretta used to say. Anyone can throw a punch. It takes discipline to hold one back. Vivian had been holding hers back for 18 years. She wasn't planning to stop now. Not for a boy like Preston Colby. Not for anyone. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, unaware that across campus, in a dorm room 3 buildings over, Preston was still talking, still laughing, still deciding, somewhere in the stubborn corners of his mind, that this wasn't over. Not even close. The following 2 weeks passed in an uneasy quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like the pause before a storm rather than the absence of one. Vivian kept her routine steady. Classes in the morning, shifts at the wagon wheel in the afternoon, practice in the basement gym at night, moving through her forms in the dim light, alone with her breathing and the soft thud of her feet against old mats. She and Dolores grew closer with each passing shift. Dolores began saving her the last slice of pie at the end of slow nights, insisting it would only go to waste otherwise. Vivian began arriving 15 minutes early just to help Dolores set up without ever being asked. You've got an old soul, you know that? Dolores told her one evening, watching Vivian stack chairs with quiet efficiency. Most kids your age can't sit still long enough to notice someone else needs help. My grandmother says the same thing, Vivian said, smiling faintly.
She sounds like a smart woman.
She is. Dolores studied her for a moment the way older people sometimes do when they sense there's more beneath the surface of someone young. You ever think about telling people more about yourself, honey? Dolores asked gently. You keep everything so close. Folks might understand you a little better if you let them in.
Vivian considered the question honestly.
Some things, she said slowly, aren't for understanding. They're just for carrying quietly until they're needed. Dolores didn't push further. She simply nodded the way people do when they respect a boundary even without fully understanding it. Meanwhile, on campus, the tension with Preston hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone underground, the way most bullying does when the target refuses to react. Elliot Sawyer, the quiet classmate from their psychology group, had started sitting a little closer to Vivian in lecture. He never said much, just small nods of acknowledgement, occasional comments about the reading. One rainy Wednesday, walking out of class together, Elliot spoke up. Hey, he said, adjusting his backpack strap nervously. I just wanted to say your section of the project was really good.
Genuinely.
Thank you, Vivian said, a little surprised. Preston's been kind of a jerk about it, Elliot added quietly, glancing around before continuing. He was talking trash about you to some guys in his dorm. I didn't say anything, but I heard it. Vivian's expression stayed calm, though a flicker of sharpness passed behind her eyes. What did he say?
Elliot hesitated. Just stuff about you thinking you're better than everyone, stuff about the diner thing. He seemed pretty worked up about it, honestly. More than it seemed worth. Vivian nodded slowly.
Thank you for telling me.
Yeah, of course. Elliot shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. I probably should have said something to him. I just don't know. Didn't want to make it worse, I guess.
You don't have to apologize for that, Vivian said gently. Not everyone has to speak up the same way. Elliot gave her a small, grateful smile, and they walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence. But Vivian carried his words with her for the rest of the day.
Preston seemed pretty worked up about it. More than it seemed worth. That was the part that stayed with her. Not the mockery itself, which she could brush off easily enough. It was the sense that something small had grown into something disproportionate in Preston's mind. That a bruised ego had turned into something closer to obsession. She thought about telling her grandmother. She decided not to. Not yet. There was nothing concrete to report, nothing beyond a feeling, a pressure building somewhere just out of sight. She had no way of knowing how right that feeling was. That weekend, Vivian sat cross-legged on her bed, a small notebook open on her lap. Sam was out with new friends from her hall. The room was quiet, lit only by the desk lamp.
Vivian didn't write in the notebook every day, just on nights when something needed to settle. She uncapped her pen and wrote slowly. Some people think quiet means empty. It doesn't. Quiet is just where I keep everything that matters most. She paused, looking at the photo on her desk, at her grandmother's steady hands resting on a smaller version of herself.
I used to think strength was something you showed people so they'd know not to mess with you. Grandma taught me something different. She said real strength doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be there when somebody smaller than you needs protecting. I think about Dolores a lot. 30 years at that diner and people still talk to her like she's invisible.
She's not invisible. She's just been patient longer than most people know how to be. I think Preston is the kind of person who has never once had to be patient in his whole life. Everything came easy. A stumble in front of 30 classmates probably felt like the end of the world to him because nothing had ever gone wrong before. That doesn't excuse how he's acting. But it helps me understand it a little. Grandma always says, hurt people either learn from the hurt or they pass it on to somebody smaller than them. I don't know which kind of person Preston is yet. I hope for his sake it's the first kind. She closed the notebook, set down her pen, and turned off the lamp. Outside her window, the campus had gone quiet for the night streetlights, humming faintly over empty sidewalks. She had no way of knowing that 3 days later she would find out exactly which kind of person Preston Colby really was. The days leading up to it felt, in hindsight, almost deceptively ordinary. On Monday, Vivian turned in her chemistry lab report early, the way she always did, and Priya teased her about it over lunch, calling her disgustingly organized in a tone that made it sound like a compliment. On Tuesday, Dolores taught her how to make the diner's Thursday special, a chicken pot pie recipe that had been on the menu since before Vivian was born, and let her take a slice home wrapped in foil. On Wednesday, Elliot lent her his notes from a psychology lecture she'd missed for a dentist appointment, apologizing twice for his handwriting, even though it was perfectly legible. Small, ordinary kindnesses, stacking quietly on top of each other. The kind that build a life without anyone noticing they're doing it. Vivian noticed, though. She always noticed. It was one of the few things her 10 years of training hadn't taught her. She had simply always paid attention to the people who were kind to her and remembered it, the way some people remembered songs. 3 days later, everything changed. It started, as these things often do, with something small. Vivian had stayed late in the library, finishing a chemistry assignment that had taken longer than expected. By the time she left, the sky outside had gone fully dark, the campus quiet, except for scattered clusters of students heading back to their dorms. She was crossing the quad, backpack slung over one shoulder, when she heard footsteps behind her, multiple sets moving with purpose. She didn't turn around immediately. Years of training had taught her to read a situation before reacting to it. "Hey, Callahan!" She recognized the voice instantly. Vivian stopped walking and turned slowly. Preston stood a few feet away, Wesley and Grady flanking him on either side. Behind them, a small cluster of other students had gathered, drawn by some instinct that something was about to happen. Someone already had a phone raised, filming. Among them stood Sam, Vivian's roommate, on her way back from a late study session. She recognized Preston. Immediately recognized the tone in his voice and felt her stomach drop. For a moment she almost stepped forward. Then she thought of Preston's father of the building on campus, with the Colby name carved into stone above the door of the stories she had already heard about students who crossed him and quietly disappeared from campus life the following semester. She stayed where she was, arms wrapped around her books, telling herself she would find a teacher, an RA, someone with more power than she had. She did not move quickly enough. Nobody in that small crowd moved quickly enough. That was the quiet, uncomfortable truth about moments like this one. It was rarely that people didn't care. It was that fear had learned to look exactly like indifference, and almost nobody could tell the difference from the outside. "Can I help you?" Vivian asked, her voice steady, betraying nothing. Preston's expression was tight, something simmering just beneath his usual easy confidence. "You made me look stupid in front of the whole class," he said. "In front of my friends, in front of everyone." "I didn't make you look like anything," Vivian said calmly. "You didn't do your part of the project. That's not on me." A murmur went through the small crowd. A couple of students exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody stepped forward. "See, this is exactly what I'm talking about," Preston said, turning slightly toward the crowd, playing to them now. "This attitude, like she's better than everybody, like the rules don't apply to her." "I never said that," Vivian replied evenly. "You didn't have to." Preston stepped closer, close enough now that Vivian could see the anger simmering beneath his forced smile. "Maybe you need someone to actually teach you a lesson about respect." Behind him, Grady laughed nervously, though it sounded less confident than it had weeks earlier at the diner. Vivian felt something settle in her chest. Not fear, something closer to clarity. "I think you should go back to your dorm, Preston," she said quietly. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." For a moment, doubt flickered across Preston's face, the smallest hesitation. Then Wesley leaned in and muttered something too low for Vivian to hear, and whatever hesitation had been there vanished, replaced by something harder. "Yeah," Preston said, his voice rising, performing now for the small, growing crowd. "And what exactly are you going to do about it?" Somewhere in the group of onlookers, a phone camera light blinked on, someone recording quietly, not brave enough to speak up, but unwilling to look away either. Vivian didn't answer his question. She simply held his gaze steady and unblinking, the same way she had held countless practice opponents' gazes over the past 10 years, right before a match began. Preston stepped even closer, close enough now that it was no longer a conversation, it was something else entirely. "Come on," he said to Wesley and Grady, his voice suddenly sharp, decisive. "Let's go teach the new girls some manners." What happened in the next 30 seconds would be talked about on campus for weeks to come. Wesley grabbed Vivian's backpack strap first, yanking it hard enough to spin her half around. Grady moved to block her path toward the dorms, his earlier nervous laughter replaced now by something uglier, something that fed off the energy of the small crowd. "Let go of me," Vivian said, her voice low, controlled, carrying a warning that none of them were prepared to hear. "Or what?" Preston said, stepping in front of her, close enough that she could smell the cologne he always wore too much of. "You gonna cry, call your grandma?" Something in Vivian went very still, not frozen, still the way deep water is still right before something moves beneath the surface. "Take us somewhere private," Preston said, suddenly glancing toward the crowd, then back at his friends, a new idea forming behind his eyes, something crueler than he'd originally planned. "The bathroom in the science building. Nobody's there this late." "Preston, man, maybe we should just—" Wesley started, some flicker of hesitation crossing his face. "Shut up and grab her arm," Preston snapped. Grady, caught up in the momentum, caught up in weeks of building resentment he barely understood, reached out and grabbed Vivian's other arm. For a moment, Vivian could have ended it right there. Every instinct, every year of training told her exactly how. But her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, steady and clear even now. "Only when there is no other choice left." There were still people watching, still a chance this would end without anyone getting hurt, without her having to reveal 10 years of discipline to a crowd that wasn't ready to understand it. So she let them pull her forward, not because she was weak, because she was choosing one final time to give this moment the benefit of the doubt. They dragged her across the quad past the library toward the science building, its windows dark except for the dim emergency lighting inside. A few students from the crowd trailed behind at a distance, phones still raised. Nobody quite brave enough to step in, nobody quite willing to look away. Elliot Sawyer was one of them. He stood frozen near the edge of the crowd, his hands trembling slightly as he held up his own phone, recording everything, his mind racing, torn between the fear of getting involved and the growing sick certainty that he couldn't just walk away. He didn't step forward. Not yet. But he didn't stop recording either. The science building doors swung shut behind them with a heavy, final sound cutting off most of the outside noise, leaving only the hum of the emergency lights and the sound of 4 sets of footsteps echoing down an empty hallway. Preston pushed open the door to the first-floor women's restroom, glancing back at Vivian with an expression that had long since abandoned any pretense of playfulness. "In there," he said. "Let's see how tough the quiet girl really is once nobody's around to save her." Vivian looked at the open door, at the dim, empty room beyond it. Then she looked at Preston and Wesley and Grady, still gripping her arms, their faces caught somewhere between adrenaline and the first faint edges of doubt. She thought of her grandmother's photo on her desk. She thought of 10 years of forms practiced in silence. She thought of one simple, steady promise made over a phone call weeks ago that felt like a lifetime away now. You only speak with your hands when there is no other choice left. Vivian took a slow breath, and for the first time since she had arrived at Maplewood University, she stopped holding back. "Last chance," she said quietly, her voice carrying a calm that made even Preston's grip loosen slightly. "Let go of me. Right now." Nobody moved. The hallway went completely silent, the kind of silence that exists only in the half-second before everything changes. Somewhere behind them near the door, a phone camera light blinked steadily, watching, recording, waiting. Preston's grip tightened on her arm. He had no idea what he was standing next to. 10 years of discipline, 10 years of patience, 10 years of a promise finally reaching its limit. Vivian took one last breath, and this time she did not back down. Some moments only last a few seconds, but they change the shape of everything that comes after. This was one of those moments. Preston Colby stood in a dim hallway of the science building, his hand wrapped around Vivian Callahan's arm, certain he understood exactly who she was. He did not understand at all. "Last chance," Vivian had said, her voice quiet, steady, carrying a weight none of them expected. "Let go of me, right now." Nobody moved. For half a second the hallway held its breath, then Preston laughed a short, uneasy sound and tightened his grip. "Or what?" he said. "You gonna fight all three of us?" That was the exact moment he found out. What happened next did not look like a movie fight. There were no dramatic flips, no shouting, no wasted motion at all. Vivian's free hand came up fast, catching Preston's wrist at a precise angle. A small twist, a shift of her weight, nothing more than that. Preston's grip broke instantly. His arm bent in a way that made him gasp, more from surprise than pain, and he stumbled back half a step, eyes wide. Grady lunged forward without thinking, grabbing for her shoulder. Vivian pivoted low, caught his arm, and redirected his own momentum. Grady's feet tangled beneath him, and he landed hard on the tile floor, more embarrassed than hurt. The wind knocked out of him in one short huff. Wesley froze completely, hands raised, taking a full step back. "Whoa!" he said. "Whoa, I didn't even touch her." Vivian straightened, breathing steady, her expression calm, not angry, not proud, just calm, the way still water looks right after a stone is already sunk beneath it. The whole exchange had taken less than 4 seconds. Preston stood there, cradling his wrist, staring at her like she had just spoken a language he didn't recognize. "What," he said slowly, "was that?" 10 years of training," Vivian said quietly. "That your friend can confirm if he ever gets back up." Grady groaned from the floor, still catching his breath. Behind them, near the door, a small cluster of students stood frozen, phones still raised, nobody quite sure what they had just witnessed. Elliot Sawyer stood among them, his own phone trembling slightly in his hand, the screen still recording every second. He had seen the whole thing, from the moment Preston grabbed her arm to the 4 seconds that followed to the stunned silence hanging in the hallway now. He did not step forward, not yet. But his thumb, almost on its own, tapped the button to save the video before anyone could ask him to delete it. Preston's face had gone through several colors in the span of a few seconds. Pale first from shock, then red from something closer to humiliation. "You attacked me," he said, his voice rising, already shifting into a different story than the one that had actually happened. "You just attacked me." "I asked you to let go," Vivian said evenly. 3 times. "That's not what happened," Preston snapped, glancing toward the small crowd searching for support. "She grabbed me first. Ask anybody." A few students exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody spoke up either way. Wesley, still standing several feet back, said nothing at all, his earlier bravado completely gone. Grady finally pushed himself up off the floor, wincing, rubbing his shoulder. "Man, my arm," he muttered, more to Preston than anyone else. "See?" Preston said quickly, pointing at him. "She hurt him. Look at that." "I'm fine," Grady mumbled, though he kept rubbing his shoulder anyway, unsure now which version of events he was supposed to believe. Vivian looked at Preston for a long moment, not with anger, with something closer to disappointment. "You should go to the health center and have that wrist checked," she said. "It's probably just strained." "I was careful." "Careful," Preston repeated, almost laughing, though there was no humor in it. "You think this is over?" "I think you should go home," Vivian said quietly. "Before this gets any worse for you." She turned, picked up her backpack from where it had fallen, and walked past the small crowd without another word. Nobody stopped her. Nobody said anything at all. The walk back to her dorm felt longer than usual. Vivian's hands were steady, her breathing calm, but her mind moved quickly, turning the last 5 minutes over and over. She had kept her promise, mostly. She had given every warning she could give. She had used only what was necessary and nothing more. But she also knew, with a certainty that settled heavy in her stomach, that this was not over. Preston Colby was not the kind of person who let embarrassment go quietly. She was right. That same night, in his room across campus, Preston sat on the edge of his bed, still cradling his wrist, though the swelling had mostly gone down within the hour. It wasn't his wrist that bothered him anymore. It was the 4 seconds. The way they kept replaying in his head, sharper each time, no matter how many times he tried to think about something else. He picked up his phone and called his father. "Dad, hey!" His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Something happened tonight. I need you to hear it from me first." His father, Richard Colby, listened without much comment while Preston explained his version of events, the version already smoothed and reshaped into something easier to say out loud. "She attacked me and my friends," Preston finished, unprovoked. "I might need to see a doctor about my wrist." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause Preston had heard many times before, the sound of his father calculating rather than reacting. "Is there video?" Richard asked finally. "There might be. I don't know for sure." "Get ahead of it," Richard said, his voice brisk, businesslike, the same tone he used for closing real estate deals. "File a report tonight, before she does. First story told is usually the one people believe, at least at first." "Okay. And Preston?" His father's voice sharpened slightly. "This is the 3rd time in 4 years I've had to make a phone call because of something you started and couldn't finish cleanly. Do you understand how that looks for this family?" Preston's jaw tightened. "I didn't start it. She's the one who—" "I don't care who started it," Richard cut in. "I care how it ends. Handle it, or I will, and you won't like how I handle things." The call ended a moment later, and Preston sat alone in the quiet of his room, staring at his phone. Something uncomfortable settling low in his stomach, a feeling he didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't quite guilt, but it was close enough to keep him awake long after midnight, filing an incident report he already suspected somewhere beneath his pride wasn't entirely true. By the time Vivian reached her dorm room, Sam was already there, curled up on her bed with her laptop, half watching something with the sound low. "Hey," Sam said, glancing up. Then she paused, taking in Vivian's face more carefully. "You okay? You look kind of pale." "I'm fine," Vivian said, setting her backpack down carefully. "Long night." Sam studied her for a moment longer, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but she didn't push. "There's leftover pizza in the mini fridge if you want it," she said instead. "No pressure to talk, just figured you might be hungry." Vivian managed a small, tired smile. "Thanks, Sam." She almost let it stay there, almost let the night end with pizza and silence and nothing more said. But Sam was still watching her patient in a way that didn't ask to be told, only offered the space in case Vivian wanted to fill it. "Okay," Vivian said, finally sitting down across from her. "It's complicated." "I've got time," Sam said, patting the empty spot on her own bed. "And for what it's worth, the version where you single-handedly took down 3 guys from the football team is currently my favorite, so you've got a high bar to disappoint me from." Despite everything, Vivian felt the corner of her mouth lift slightly. She sat down and told her roommate the truth. All of it. The hallway, the warnings, what happened after. Sam listened without interrupting, her expression shifting slowly from surprise to anger to something firmer by the time Vivian finished. "That's insane," Sam said flatly. "They grabbed you. 2 against 1 plus Preston, and you're telling me you're the one who might get in trouble for this?" "That's what I'm worried about, yes." "That's not a worry, that's a joke," Sam said, shaking her head. "A bad one." She paused, studying Vivian more carefully. "Wait, 10 years of training, what exactly does that mean?" Vivian glanced at the small photo on her desk. "It means my grandmother didn't want me to ever feel like I needed someone else to keep me safe," she said quietly. "She's been teaching me since I was 7. Sam let out a low whistle. Remind me never to steal your fries. I'll allow the fries, Vivian said, and for the first time in hours she laughed just a little, the tension in her shoulders loosening slightly. For real though, Sam added, her voice softening. Whatever happens next, you're not going through this alone. I don't care how many buildings that guy's last name is on. Vivian looked at her roommate for a long moment, feeling something warm settle in her chest, something she hadn't expected to find this quickly in a town she barely knew. Thank you, Sam. Don't thank me yet, Sam said, already reaching for her laptop again. I'm about to go write a strongly worded email to Student Affairs, and I have a lot of feelings to get out. Vivian went to bed that night, believing the worst of it was already behind her. That 4 seconds in a hallway had been the hardest part, and that whatever came next would be easier simply because the truth was finally on her side. She was wrong about that, too. By the next morning, the video was already spreading, not widely, not yet, but enough. A handful of students had seen it in their group chats before their first class even started. A blurry, shaky clip showing Preston Colby grabbing Vivian's arm and 4 fast seconds of motion that ended with him stumbling back and Grady on the floor. The captions attached to it varied wildly. Some said Vivian had attacked them unprovoked. Others said Preston had it coming. A few simply asked in disbelief, who is this girl? Vivian didn't see any of it before her first class. She didn't check her phone much in the mornings, a habit her grandmother had encouraged since childhood. She found out the hard way instead. Walking into her Intro to Psychology lecture, she felt every head in the room turn just slightly as she made her way to her usual seat in the back. Whispers followed her down the aisle. She kept her eyes forward, her expression calm, and sat down without acknowledging any of it. Elliot slid into the seat beside her a moment later, his face tight with worry. You okay? He asked quietly before class started. I'm fine, Vivian said. Why? Elliot hesitated, glancing around before lowering his voice further. There's a video going around, from last night. Vivian's stomach tightened slightly, though her face stayed calm. I figured there might be, she said. It's not bad, Elliot added quickly. I mean, it doesn't look bad for you. It's just people are talking. Before Vivian could respond, Professor Ellison walked in, and the room settled into its usual rhythm, though the whispers didn't fully disappear, just dropped low enough to hide beneath the lecture. Vivian spent the entire class only half listening, her mind circling back again and again to 4 seconds in a hallway and everything that might come from them. She had followed every rule her grandmother taught her. She had given every warning. She still felt somewhere deep in her chest the old fear that doing the right thing wouldn't be enough to protect her from what came next. That fear turned out to be justified faster than she expected. At exactly 11:15 that morning, Vivian received an email from the Office of Student Conduct requesting her presence at a meeting that afternoon at 3 o'clock. The subject line read simply, Incident Report Review. She read it twice, standing in the hallway outside her chemistry class, her stomach sinking slowly. She had not filed any report. Someone else had. At 2:55 that afternoon, Vivian sat in a small waiting area outside the Office of Student Conduct, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight. She had called her grandmother during her lunch break, keeping her voice steady, even as she explained what had happened. Loretta had listened without interrupting, the way she always did. You did exactly what we practiced, she said finally. Warnings first, minimum force, nothing more than necessary. I know, Vivian said, but they're saying I attacked them. People who cause harm rarely tell the story the way it actually happened, Loretta said, her voice calm but firm. That's not new, Vivian. That's just how frightened, prideful people protect themselves. What do I do? You tell the truth, Loretta said simply, clearly, calmly, one time. And then you let the truth do the rest of the work, even if it takes longer than you'd like. Vivian held on to those words now, sitting outside an office that held her academic future in its hands, waiting to be called in. The door opened at exactly 3 o'clock. Miss Callahan, we're ready for you. The man who greeted her was tall, silver-haired, wearing a gray suit that looked slightly too formal for a Tuesday afternoon. His nameplate read, Dean Robert Whitfield, Office of Student Conduct. His expression was polite but distant, the kind of politeness that exists mostly for appearances.
"Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing toward a chair across from his desk.
Vivian sat down carefully. On the desk between them lay a printed still image pulled from the video showing the exact moment Preston stumbled backward, clutching his wrist. "I'll be direct with you, Miss Callahan," Dean Whitfield said, folding his hands together. "We've received a complaint alleging that you assaulted 3 students last night, unprovoked, resulting in a minor injury."
"That's not what happened," Vivian said calmly. "I understand you may see it differently," Dean Whitfield said in a tone that suggested he did not particularly believe her. "But we do have video evidence along with statements from 2 witnesses." "There's more video than what they gave you," Vivian said. "It shows exactly what happened before that moment."
3 people surrounded me. 2 of them grabbed my arms. I gave 3 clear warnings before I did anything. Dean Whitfield's expression flickered just slightly, something close to discomfort passing behind his eyes. "We'll certainly review any additional footage that becomes available," he said, though his tone didn't shift much. "In the meantime, given the seriousness of the allegations, I have to consider a temporary suspension while this matter is fully investigated."
Vivian felt something cold settle in her chest. "A suspension," she repeated quietly. "For defending myself." "For an altercation resulting in injury," Dean Whitfield corrected, though the correction felt thin even to him. "I understand this is difficult to hear." What Vivian did not know, sitting in that office, was the reason behind Dean Whitfield's careful, uneasy tone. 3 years earlier, his own son, a mediocre student with little chance of admission on his own merit, had been accepted into Maplewood University under unusual circumstances, shortly after a substantial donation from the Colby family funded a new scholarship program. Nothing illegal had happened, nothing that could ever be proven, at least. But Dean Whitfield understood, in the quiet, uncomfortable way people understand debts they never openly acknowledge, that his family owed something to the Colbys that had nothing to do with paperwork. He told himself this had nothing to do with that. He was not entirely convincing even to himself. "I'd like to review the full video before any decision is made," Vivian said steadily, refusing to let her voice shake. "The footage from a witness named Elliot Sawyer, it shows everything that happened before I acted." Dean Whitfield hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "I wasn't aware there was additional footage," he said carefully. "There is," Vivian said. "I'd ask that you review it before making any decision that affects my education." For a long moment the dean studied her, something in her calm, steady insistence clearly unsettling him more than shouting or tears would have. "I'll look into it," he said finally. "In the meantime, I'm placing you on temporary suspension from campus activities pending review. You'll still be permitted to attend classes, but I'll need you to avoid contact with the other students involved." Vivian nodded once, her jaw tight, though she said nothing further. She stood, thanked him with a politeness she did not entirely feel, and walked out of the office with her spine straight and her hands steady, refusing to let anyone see how much the ground had just shifted beneath her. Outside in the late afternoon sun, she finally allowed herself one slow, unsteady breath. She had followed every rule, and it still might not be enough. Word of the suspension spread almost as fast as the video had. By the time Vivian reached the dining hall that evening, the whispers had multiplied, splitting into 2 clear camps, the way rumors on a small campus always seem to do. Some students, mostly friends of Preston's from the football program, repeated his version without question. She just snapped on them, came out of nowhere. Some people can't handle a little teasing. Others, quieter, less certain, simply exchanged uneasy glances whenever Vivian walked past, unsure what to believe, unwilling to take a side in either direction. Vivian kept her head up and her tray steady, choosing a table near the back, the way she chose most things. She had barely sat down when a young woman she recognized from her chemistry lecture approached, holding her own tray, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, Vivian, right?" "That's right." "I'm Priya. We're lab partners on Tuesdays." She sat down across from Vivian without waiting for an invitation,
setting her tray down with quiet determination. I heard what people are saying about the thing in the science building. Vivian braced herself slightly, half expecting another version of the same tired story, another voice repeating what was easiest to believe. For what it's worth, Priya continued, my roommate's cousin was actually there. She said Preston and his friends grabbed you first. Multiple witnesses saw it. People just don't always say the true version out loud because it's easier to repeat the version that doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. Vivian looked at her, something in her chest loosening slightly. Thank you for telling me that, she said quietly. I just think it's messed up, Priya said, stabbing at her salad with more force than necessary. Everyone's so scared of Preston's family that they'll believe whatever keeps them comfortable. It's not fair to you. No, Vivian agreed, it isn't. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Vivian found herself grateful for it. Grateful for one small, steady voice willing to say the quiet truth out loud, even if it was only across a dining hall table. Fairness had a way of arriving slowly sometimes, but it rarely arrived completely, alone. That evening, Vivian went to the basement gym the way she always did when her thoughts grew too loud to sit with quietly. She moved through her forms slower than usual, letting each motion stretch out, giving her mind room to settle between each breath. Block, step, turn, strike, breathe. The old cracked, heavy bag swung gently under her hands, the familiar rhythm grounding her in a way words rarely could. She thought about the suspension, about Dean Whitfield's careful, distant politeness, about the quiet unfairness of being punished for surviving something she never asked for. She thought about her grandmother's church basement in Fairbridge, about 30 years of women learning they didn't have to be afraid about the people who had tried more than once to make that stop. They kept showing up anyway. Vivian threw one final strike, controlled and precise, and let her hands drop to her sides, breathing steady in the dim, empty room. Whatever happened next, she decided she would keep showing up too. She had not been scheduled to work that week, given the suspension, but she stopped by the wagon wheel anyway on her way back from the gym, just to see a familiar face. Dolores spotted her through the window and waved her in before she could change her mind. Sit, Dolores said, already pouring a glass of lemonade without being asked. I heard some of what happened. Not all of it, I'm sure, but enough. It's a mess, Vivian admitted, sliding onto a stool at the counter. Most worthwhile things are, at some point, Dolores said, leaning against the counter across from her. You know, my Walt used to say something about this. About folks who cause trouble and then cry the loudest when trouble finally catches up to them. What did he say? He said the ones who shout the most about being wronged are usually the ones most afraid of being seen clearly, Dolores said. 28 years wearing a badge taught him that much, at least. Vivian turned her glass slowly on the counter, thinking about that. I keep wondering if I should have just walked away, she said quietly, before any of it happened. Honey, you did walk away, plenty of times, from what I understand, Dolores said gently. There's a difference between walking away from trouble and letting trouble corner you until you've got no choice left. You didn't go looking for that hallway. It came looking for you. Vivian managed a small, tired smile. You always know what to say. 30 years behind this counter, Dolores said, patting her hand warmly. You learn a thing or two about people, and about which ones deserve your worry and which ones don't. Before Vivian left, Dolores pressed a small paper bag into her hands, warm from the oven, the smell of cinnamon still clinging to it. For the walk back, Dolores said, waving off the thanks before Vivian could offer any. A person thinks better on a full stomach. Trust me on that one. Vivian left the diner 20 minutes later, the weight in her chest just slightly easier to carry. Grateful, not for the first time, that this small town had handed her a friend she hadn't known she needed. That evening, Officer Hank Douglas sat in the small security office near the main gate of campus, reviewing the day's incident logs, the way he did every evening, out of habit more than obligation. Hank was 63 years old, broad-shouldered with a gray mustache and the kind of steady, watchful eyes that 31 years on the Fairbridge police force had given him. He'd taken the campus security job 2 years earlier, after retiring mostly because sitting at home had started to feel like slowly disappearing. The log entry caught his attention immediately. Incident report. Altercation near Hendricks Science Building. Preston, Colby, Wesley, Nash, Grady, Simmons versus Vivian Callahan. Colby. Hank's eyes narrowed slightly at the name. He remembered vaguely hearing about a complaint from a few years back, from when he was still occasionally consulted by the local police department on matters involving prominent local families. A quiet complaint filed and then quickly withdrawn involving the Colby name. Nothing had ever come of it. The family's lawyer had been fast and thorough, and the whole matter had simply evaporated within a week. Hank had never forgotten it, though. Not because it was dramatic, because it was quiet. And quiet things, in his experience, often had a way of repeating themselves. He pulled up the incident report on his computer screen, reading through it slowly. The official complaint filed by Preston Colby himself described Vivian Callahan as the aggressor, claiming she had attacked all 3 young men without provocation. Hank frowned, rereading the report a second time. Something about it didn't sit right. He'd spent 3 decades reading statements, learning to hear the small inconsistencies hidden beneath confident words. And Preston's statement, though detailed, felt rehearsed. Too clean. Too convenient. He decided quietly to ask a few questions of his own, the way he always had, one conversation at a time, never in a hurry, never showing his hand before he was ready. The next morning, before his shift officially started, Hank walked the short distance to the Wagon Wheel Diner, a place he'd been eating breakfast at for nearly 15 years, long before he ever worked at Maplewood. Dolores greeted him with her usual warm smile, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter before he'd even sat down. "Morning, Hank. The usual?" "Please," he said, settling onto his stool. "Quiet morning." "Quieter than yesterday," Dolores said, wiping down the counter. "Had some excitement around here last night, apparently. My new girl got herself into some kind of trouble on campus." Hank's eyebrows rose slightly. "New girl. Vivian. Sweet as anything. Works the evening shift with me most days." Dolores shook her head slowly. "I don't know all the details, but from what I heard, some football players cornered her and she ended up in some kind of scuffle." "You know her well?" Hank asked, his voice carefully casual. "Well enough to know she's not the type to start trouble," Dolores said firmly. "That girl stood up for me not 2 weeks after she started working here, when some spoiled kid decided it was funny to mock an old woman's hands shaking a little." Her expression softened. "She didn't have to do that. Most people wouldn't have." Hank sipped his coffee slowly, thinking. "You wouldn't happen to know if that spoiled kid's name was Preston Colby, would you?" Dolores's eyes narrowed slightly. "How'd you know that?" "Lucky guess," Hank said quietly, though it wasn't luck at all. He finished his coffee, left a generous tip, and walked back toward campus with a familiar, uneasy feeling settling into his gut, the kind of feeling that had rarely steered him wrong over 30 years of police work. Something about this story had more layers than anyone at that meeting yesterday had bothered to look for. He intended to look for them himself, the last piece already beginning to fall into place in his mind, though he wasn't ready to say so out loud, not even to himself. 2 days passed in a strange, suspended kind of quiet. Not everyone on campus had settled comfortably into Preston's version of events. Wesley Nash sat alone at the far end of the cafeteria that same afternoon, pushing food around his tray without much interest. Grady dropped into the seat across from him a moment later, still favoring his shoulder slightly. "You've been weird since Tuesday," Grady said. "I've been thinking," Wesley said quietly. "About what?" Wesley glanced around before lowering his voice. "About the report Preston filed. He said she attacked us first. That's not exactly how I remember it." Grady shifted uncomfortably. "Man, don't start this. I'm not starting anything. I'm just saying." Wesley set down his fork. "She told him to let go. 3 times. I heard it." "You heard it too." "So what, you want to just, tell everyone Preston lied?" "I don't know what I want," Wesley admitted. "I just don't love that my name is attached to a story that isn't true." Grady didn't answer right away. He picked at his food, clearly wrestling with something similar, though neither of them said it out loud. His dad's basically running this whole thing now, Grady said eventually. You really want to be the guy who goes against that? Wesley didn't have an answer for that either, not yet. But the question stayed with him for the rest of the day, quiet and persistent, the way true things often do when they're waiting for someone brave enough to finally say them. Grady, for his part, said nothing more about it. But he noticed over the following days that he stopped laughing quite as easily whenever Preston brought the story up with new people retelling it a little differently each time, the details sharpening in his own favor with every version. Vivian attended her classes as required, though she noticed the whispers hadn't fully faded, and a few students who used to nod politely in the hallway now avoided her eyes entirely. Elliot walked with her more often now, a quiet, steady presence beside her in the hallways, though he still hadn't offered his video footage to anyone official. I want to help, he told her quietly on the second afternoon as they walked together toward the library. I keep thinking about what happens after. Preston's dad basically funds half the athletic department. If I hand this over and it doesn't work, I'm the guy who tried to take down the football program's favorite son and failed. Vivian nodded slowly, understanding more than she let on. I'm not asking you to do anything, she said. I mean that. I know, Elliot said. That almost makes it worse, honestly. You're not even asking, and I still can't make myself do it. They walked in silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun slanting long shadows across the sidewalk. My grandmother has a saying, Vivian said eventually. She says courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing anyway, at your own pace, when you're finally ready. Elliot glanced at her, something like relief crossing his face. Your grandmother sounds like she'd be a good person to know, he said. She is, Vivian said simply. That evening, Vivian called home again, sitting on the small balcony outside her dorm building, the phone pressed to her ear, the campus quiet below her. They're talking about suspending me, she told Loretta, for defending myself. I know how that feels, Loretta said, her voice steady, though something in it carried an old familiar weight. People in positions of comfort rarely enjoy being reminded that comfort isn't the same as fairness. Have you dealt with this before? Vivian asked. Something like this? There was a pause on the line longer than usual. A long time ago, Loretta said finally, before you were born. I ran a self-defense class for women in Fairbridge for over 30 years, Vivian. Free classes, most of them held in the basement of a small church on Union Street. I taught women who had never been allowed to believe they could protect themselves. Vivian sat up, slightly surprised. Her grandmother rarely spoke about the details of those years. I never knew it was in Fairbridge, she said slowly. I thought that was somewhere else. It's a small world sometimes, Loretta said, a faint, knowing warmth in her voice. Smaller than people realize. Did people ever try to stop you back then? More than once, Loretta said. There were always people uncomfortable with quiet women, learning they didn't have to stay afraid. But the ones who mattered, the ones who truly needed it, they kept showing up anyway. That's how you know something is worth doing, Vivian. Not because it's easy, because people keep showing up for it, even when it's hard. Did you ever want to quit? Vivian asked. When people made it difficult? Every winter for about 3 years straight, Loretta said, and Vivian could hear the small smile in her voice. There was a man on the church board back then who thought a room full of women learning to defend themselves was, in his words, unnecessary and unbecoming. He tried twice to have the class removed from the schedule. What happened? The pastor at the time was a woman named Ruth Sharper, than any man on that board put together. She told him the class stayed or she'd find a church that understood what its basement was actually for. Loretta chuckled softly. The class stayed for 31 years after that, Vivian. Long after that man stopped showing up to complain. Vivian smiled faintly, picturing it, a small church basement full of quiet, determined women and one sharp, unshakable pastor standing between them and anyone who thought their safety was optional. I wish I could have seen that, she said.
You will, in your own way, Loretta said. Every generation gets its own version of that basement, Vivian. Its own version of people who'd rather you stay quiet and afraid, and its own version of someone standing between you and them. Right now, that's simply your version of the story. You just haven't seen all of it yet. Vivian held on to those words long after the call ended, staring out at the dark campus below her, the weight in her chest just slightly lighter than it had been an hour earlier. She still didn't know how this would end, but she was beginning to understand more clearly than before that she wasn't standing entirely alone. Not really. Not even here in a town she'd only just started to call home. The following afternoon, Vivian sat alone in her dorm room staring at a blank document on her laptop screen, a half-finished draft of an email to the registrar's office. Subject line, "Request for voluntary withdrawal." She had typed 3 sentences and deleted them twice. Part of her, the tired, quiet part that had spent 2 straight days feeling every whispered conversation stop the moment she entered a room, wanted simply to leave, to transfer somewhere else, somewhere nobody knew her name, yet where she could start over without 4 seconds in a hallway following her everywhere she went. It would be easier, she told herself. Easier than fighting a system that already seemed to have decided who deserved the benefit of the doubt. She stared at the blinking cursor for a long time, then she closed the laptop without sending anything. Running wasn't the same as choosing peace. Her grandmother had taught her that too, though not in words. Just in the way Loretta had stayed in Fairbridge for 30 years teaching quiet women to stand taller even when some people wished she would simply go away. Vivian picked up the small photo from her desk instead, studying it closely. The little girl in the white uniform, the steady hands on her shoulders. "Okay," she said quietly to no one but herself. "Not yet." She set the photo back down, opened her chemistry textbook instead and got back to work, refusing to let this be the version of the story where she disappeared quietly. 2 days later, Officer Hank Douglas sat at his desk long after his shift had technically ended, an old case file open in front of him, retrieved from the archived records of the Fairbridge Police Department, with the help of a former colleague who still owed him a favor or two. The file was 7 years old. It documented a complaint filed by a family in a neighboring county, alleging that their son had been physically intimidated and threatened by a group of students during a high school football camp, one of them identified as Preston Colby, then a freshman. The complaint had been withdrawn less than a week after it was filed, following what the file vaguely described as a private resolution between the families involved. Hank read the file twice, his jaw tight. Then he found a second file, this one from 4 years earlier, a nearly identical pattern. A complaint, a brief investigation, a sudden, quiet withdrawal. 2 incidents, 2 families, 2 situations that simply disappeared before anyone in power had to answer difficult questions. Hank leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes. 31 years on the force had taught him plenty of things, but one lesson stood above the rest, learned early and confirmed again and again over the decades. Patterns didn't lie, even when people did. He picked up his desk phone and dialed Dean Whitfield's office directly. His voice, calm but carrying the same steady authority that had once made hardened suspects tell him the truth without ever being asked twice. "Dean Whitfield," he said when the call connected. "This is Officer Douglas, campus security. I think we need to talk about the Colby situation, and I think you're going to want to hear what I found before you make any final decisions." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'll clear some time this afternoon," Dean Whitfield said finally, his voice noticeably less steady than it had been in his meeting with Vivian 3 days earlier. The meeting happened at 4 o'clock that afternoon in the same office where Vivian had sat 3 days earlier. Hank laid the 2 case files on the desk without ceremony, along with a brief summary he had typed up himself, careful and precise the way he had written 1,000 reports before. Dean Whitfield read through them slowly, his face growing paler with each page. "These were withdrawn," he said finally, weakly. "Both complaints. Nothing was ever proven." "No," Hank agreed. "Nothing was ever proven because both families backed down within a week of filing. That's not the same thing as nothing happening, Dean. You know that as well as I do. Whitfield rubbed a hand over his face, silent for a long moment. I have a suspension in place, he said finally. Based on the evidence I had at the time. You had one witness statement, written by the young man with the most reason in the world to lie, Hank said evenly. I'd strongly recommend reviewing any additional footage before that suspension goes any further. I understand there may be more of it than what was originally submitted. Whitfield looked up sharply. You've seen it? Not yet, Hank said, but I intend to. The dean was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the two old case files at a pattern 7 years in the making that he had never once been shown before today. I'll reopen the review, he said finally, his voice quieter now, some of its earlier certainty gone. Full review. All available footage. Good, Hank said simply, gathering his files. That's all I'm asking. He sat alone at his own desk again that evening, out of habit more than necessity, looking once more at the two case files spread out in front of him. For the first time since this whole thing started, he allowed himself a small, tired smile. The truth, once it started moving, had a way of refusing to stay quiet for long. Outside evening was settling over Maplewood University, the sky fading into soft shades of orange and gray above the old brick buildings. Vivian didn't know yet about the phone call or the case files or the quiet, careful work already being done on her behalf by people she barely knew. She only knew that tomorrow was another day she intended to face without running. She sat by her window that night, watching the campus lights flicker on, one by one, and thought about her grandmother's words from years ago, spoken on a porch step over lemonade in a summer that felt like a lifetime ago now. You practice so that your body already knows what to do before your fear has time to argue with it. She hadn't fully understood back then that the same lesson applied to more than just her hands. It applied to staying, to waiting, to trusting that patience held long enough eventually turned into something that looked a great deal like strength. She turned off her lamp, closed her eyes, and let sleep finally come. Across the hall, Elliot Sawyer sat awake much later than usual, staring at a single saved video file on his phone, his thumb hovering over the share button, then pulling back, then hovering again. He thought about Priya's words at dinner that night, quiet but firm. People just don't always say the true version out loud because it's easier to repeat the version that doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. He thought about Wesley, 2 tables away in the dining hall earlier, picking at his food, clearly carrying some version of the same discomfort Elliot felt. He wasn't ready yet. Not tonight. But for the first time since that night outside the science building, he found himself thinking less about what might happen if he came forward, and more about what it might feel like to finally stop carrying the weight of staying silent. He set his phone down on the nightstand, screen still dark, and told himself quietly that tomorrow might be different. Somewhere across town in a quiet office lit by a single desk lamp, Officer Hank Douglas was still reading, still connecting old, quiet threads that had waited 7 years to finally be pulled. Neither of them knew yet how closely their paths were about to cross, but somewhere, deep beneath the surface of a small town that thought it already knew all its own stories, the truth was finally beginning to stand up, quietly, patiently, the way most true things eventually do, whether anyone is ready for them or not. Some truths take days to surface. Others take years. This one had been waiting 7 of them. Elliot Sawyer woke up before his alarm the next morning, the ceiling above his bed the first thing he saw in the gray, early light. He had barely slept. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, the saved video still sitting there, untouched since the night before. He thought about Vivian sitting alone in the back of every classroom, carrying a suspension she never deserved with more grace than he could have managed. He thought about his own silence and how much longer he was willing to let it stretch. By 7:30 he was dressed and walking across campus, the video already forwarded to himself twice, just in case his hands steady despite the nervous knot in his stomach. He found Officer Douglas exactly where Dolores had told him he would be, in the small security office near the main gate, a cup of coffee steaming on the desk in front of him. "Officer Douglas,"
Hank looked up from his paperwork, taking in the young man standing nervously in his doorway. "Can I help you, son?" "My name's Elliot Sawyer," he said. "I was there. The night in the science building. I have video of the whole thing from before Preston even grabbed her." Hank set down his pen slowly, giving the young man his full attention. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me everything." Elliot sat, and for the next 20 minutes he did exactly that, laying out every detail he remembered, every word spoken in that hallway, every second captured on his phone. When he finished, Hank leaned back in his chair, studying him carefully. "Why now?" he asked. "You've had this for 3 days. Elliot was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my place," he said finally. "That someone else would say something, that it would sort itself out." He shook his head slowly. "But nobody else did say something. And watching her get punished for something she didn't do while I sat there being careful, it stopped feeling like caution. It just felt like cowardice." Hank nodded slowly, respect settling into the lines of his face. "That took guts, showing up here," he said. "More guts than a lot of grown men I've known." "I should have done it sooner, maybe," Hank said, "but you did it. That's what matters now. Can you send that video to this email address?" Elliot nodded, already pulling out his phone. Within minutes, the footage had transferred, sitting now in an official evidence folder, ready to change the shape of everything that followed. "One more thing," Hank said as Elliot stood to leave. "Would you be willing to make an official statement at a hearing, if it comes to that?" Elliot hesitated only briefly. "Yes," he said, "I would." Hank watched him go, then turned back to his desk, pulling up the video Elliot had sent, watching it carefully from start to finish. Every warning Vivian had given clearly audible. Every hand that grabbed her first. Every second of restraint before she finally acted. Hank exhaled slowly. The last piece he needed had just fallen into place. He picked up his phone and dialed Dean Whitfield's office once more. "We need to talk again," he said. "Today, if possible. I think we finally have the full picture." Whitfield agreed to meet that afternoon, and by the end of it, the review he had promised Hank days earlier was formally reopened. Evidence gathered, witnesses contacted, a hearing scheduled for the following week. Word of it reached Vivian 2 days later in the form of a short, formal email confirming a date and time. She read it 3 times before setting her phone down, feeling something in her chest that wasn't quite relief. Not yet, but was at least a little closer to it than fear. A few days later, on the morning of the hearing, Vivian woke before her alarm the same way Elliot had days earlier, her mind already turning over everything that might happen in the hours ahead. She didn't reach for her phone. Instead, she pulled on a light jacket over her pajamas and walked quietly down to the basement gym, the hallway still dim and empty at that hour. She didn't turn on the lights. She simply stood in the center of the old, worn mats, closed her eyes, and breathed. Block, step, turn, strike, breathe. She moved through where terms slowly, deliberately letting the familiar rhythm settle the nervous energy building in her chest. This wasn't about the hearing. Not really, it never had been. It was about remembering, clearly and calmly, exactly who she was, regardless of what anyone in that conference room decided to believe about her. By the time she finished, the first gray light of morning had begun filtering through the small basement window. She showered, dressed carefully, and looked at herself once in the mirror before leaving. Not proud, not afraid, just steady. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock in a small conference room adjacent to the Office of Student Conduct. Word had spread quickly across campus by then, the way word always did at a school small enough for everyone to know everyone else's business within a matter of days. Vivian sat in the hallway outside the conference room that morning, her hands folded in her lap, Sam sitting beside her for moral support, though only Vivian Preston and their direct witnesses had been asked to attend the formal proceedings. "You've got this," Sam said quietly, squeezing her hand once. "I'll be right here when you're done." Vivian nodded, grateful, though her stomach still felt tight with uncertainty. She had called her grandmother the night before the conversation, short but steady.
just tell the truth, Loretta had said. Clearly, calmly, the way we practiced. Let the rest follow. What if it doesn't follow? Vivian had asked. What if they don't believe me even now? There had been a brief pause on the line. Then you'll still know you told the truth, Loretta said. That matters more than whether everyone else chooses to believe it, though. I suspect this time they will. Vivian held on to those words now, sitting in a quiet hallway waiting to be called inside. The door opened at 9 o'clock sharp. Miss Callahan, we're ready for you. Inside the room was small but formal, a long table at the front where Dean Whitfield sat, flanked by two other administrators Vivian didn't recognize. Officer Douglas stood near the side wall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Preston sat across the room with his parents, his mother's expression tight and controlled, his father's posture radiating the same brisk confidence Vivian remembered from every story she'd heard about the Colby name. Wesley and Grady sat a few rows back, both noticeably subdued. Vivian took her seat at a small table facing the panel, back straight, hands folded. Dean Whitfield cleared his throat. We're here today to review the full circumstances surrounding the incident of 2 weeks ago, he said, his voice carrying a formality that hadn't been present in his first meeting with Vivian. New evidence has come to light since our initial review, and I want to ensure every relevant fact is considered before any final decision is made. He nodded toward Officer Douglas. Officer Douglas, please proceed. Hank stepped forward, a folder in hand. 2 weeks ago, I began looking into inconsistencies in the original incident report, he said. What I found was footage taken by a witness named Elliot Sawyer, showing the full encounter from its beginning, not just the 4 seconds initially submitted as evidence. He paused, glancing briefly at the panel before continuing. I want to be clear about something before we begin, he added. In 31 years on the Fairbridge police force, I learned that the loudest version of a story isn't always the truest one. It's simply the version that gets told first by whoever feels most entitled to be believed. I'd ask this panel to keep that in mind as we go through what actually happened. Dean Whitfield nodded slowly, motioning for him to continue. With the panel's permission, I'd like to show that footage now. Dean Whitfield nodded again. The video played across the screen, clear and steady, exactly as Elliot had captured it. Preston's voice, sharp and mocking, echoing through the small room. Leslie grabbing Vivian's backpack strap, Grady blocking her path, Preston's own words unmistakable. Let's go teach the new girls some manners. The room went silent as Vivian's voice followed, calm and clear even through the small laptop speakers. Last chance. Let go of me, right now. Then the 4 seconds. Preston's grip breaking under Vivian's careful, controlled response, Grady stumbling to the floor, Wesley freezing, hands raised. The video ended, and for a long moment nobody in the room spoke. Preston's father was the first to break the silence, leaning forward sharply. This proves nothing, he said. My son was defending himself in a chaotic situation. Your son can be heard on this recording explicitly stating his intention to, quote, teach the new girl a lesson, Dean Whitfield said, his voice noticeably firmer now than it had been 2 weeks earlier. That is not the language of self-defense, Mr. Colby. Richard Colby's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, at least for the moment. Hank cleared his throat, continuing. There's additional context the panel should be aware of, he said, opening his folder. This is not the first time Mr. Colby's name has appeared in a similar situation. He laid the 2 old case files on the table, walking the panel through both incidents carefully, methodically, the way he had once walked juries through evidence during his years on the force. Preston's mother's composed expression finally cracked slightly, glancing sideways at her son with something that looked, for the first time, like genuine doubt. Both of these complaints were withdrawn, Richard said quickly. Nothing was ever proven in either case. They were withdrawn within days of being filed, following contact between the families involved, Hank said evenly. I'm not asking this panel to draw conclusions from incidents that weren't fully investigated at the time. I'm simply asking them to notice a pattern that deserved more attention than it received. Dean Whitfield made a note, his expression grave. Miss Callahan, he said, turning toward Vivian, Would you like to make a statement?
Vivian stood slowly, her hands steady despite the weight of every eye in the room. I gave 3 clear warnings before I acted, she said, her voice calm and even. I used only what was necessary to protect myself, nothing more. I've spent 10 years training specifically so that I would never need to use that training carelessly.
I didn't want to use it that night either. I simply ran out of other options. She paused, glancing briefly toward Preston, who wouldn't meet her eyes.
I don't say any of this out of anger, she continued. I say it because I think it's important that people understand something. Being quiet isn't the same as being weak, and being loud isn't the same as being strong.
I hope whatever happens today, that's something everyone in this room walks away remembering.
She sat back down, the room silent around her. Dean Whitfield turned toward the 2 young men sitting a few rows back. Mr. Nash, he said, your original statement supported Mr. Colby's version of events. Do you stand by that statement? Wesley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing briefly at Preston before looking back at the panel.
No, sir, he said, his voice quieter than usual but clear. I don't.
A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Preston's head snapped toward him sharply. She warned us 3 times, Wesley continued, forcing himself to keep speaking despite the tightness in his chest. I heard it clearly. I signed that first statement because Preston asked me to, and because I didn't want things to get complicated for me.
That was wrong. I should have told the truth from the beginning. Wesley, Preston said sharply under his breath.
I'm sorry, Wesley said, not looking at him, but I'm done saying things that aren't true just to make this easier for you. Dean Whitfield made another note. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Nash, he said. That took courage. Grady said nothing, staring down at his hands, though he gave a small, silent nod when the panel glanced his way, confirming without words that he no longer stood behind the original story either. Dean Whitfield looked down at his notes for a long moment. We'll take a brief recess, he said finally. The panel needs time to review everything presented today. As the room began to empty for the recess, a commotion started near the back doors, voices rising just outside the conference room. Hank moved quickly toward the noise, opening the door to find a young woman standing in the hallway, phone in hand, clearly agitated, arguing quietly but urgently with a campus staff member, trying to keep the hallway clear. I need to be in there, the young woman said. This is important, please. Ma'am, this is a closed proceeding. Vivian, standing nearby with Sam, recognized the young woman immediately. Chloe Barrett, a junior, someone Vivian had occasionally seen with Preston around campus in the early weeks of the semester. Preston's expression, visible through the open doorway, shifted instantly from cautious composure to open alarm. Chloe, what are you doing here? He said sharply, stepping forward. What I should have done a long time ago, Chloe said, her voice shaking slightly, though she didn't back down. She turned to the staff member. Please, I have something the panel needs to see. It's important. Dean Whitfield, hearing the commotion, stepped into the doorway himself. What is this regarding? A video, Chloe said. Preston sent it to me 2 weeks ago, bragging about what happened. I didn't want to get involved. I told myself it wasn't my business. Her voice wavered slightly. But watching everyone talk about this the last 2 weeks, watching him act like the victim, I can't stay quiet about it anymore. Preston's face had gone pale. Chloe, don't, he said quietly, urgently. Please. I'm sorry, Preston, she said, and for a moment something close to genuine regret crossed her face. But I'm done covering for you. Dean Whitfield glanced toward Hank, then nodded slowly. Bring it in, he said. The panel will review it before making any final decision. The recess extended by another 20 minutes as the panel gathered again. Chloe, seated nervously near the front, her phone connected now to the same projector that had shown Elliot's footage earlier. The video began to play. It showed Preston, alone in his dorm room, clearly speaking into his own camera, the kind of casual, unguarded confidence of someone who never imagined the footage leaving his own phone. So get this, Preston said on the recording, laughing slightly. That weird, quiet girl from the diner, the one who thinks she's better than everybody, grabbed her tonight. Wesley and Grady helped me pull her into the science building. Should have seen her face. He grinned at the camera, clearly proud of himself. Anyway, filing a report tonight, saying she attacked us first. Dad says get ahead of it. Should be an easy suspension for her. Worth it just to see her finally scared for once. The video ended. The room was utterly silent. Preston's mother closed her eyes, one hand pressed briefly to her forehead. His father stared straight ahead, his composure finally visibly cracking. Dean Whitfield looked at Preston for a long, heavy moment. "Mr. Colby," he said finally, his voice quiet but absolutely steady, "would you care to revise your original statement?" Preston said nothing. He simply stared down at his own hands, his earlier confidence completely gone. There was nothing left to revise. The truth in his own voice on his own recording had already said everything that needed saying. The panel called a short break before reconvening for final deliberations. Outside in the hallway, Chloe stood alone near the window, arms wrapped around herself, looking shaken by what she had just done. Vivian approached her slowly. "Thank you," Vivian said quietly. "I know that wasn't easy." Chloe looked up, surprised. "You're thinking me? I dated him for 2 months and never said a word about the things I heard him say about people? I should have done something a long time before this." "You did it when it counted," Vivian said, echoing without quite realizing it the same words she had offered Elliot days earlier. "That matters more than when you finally decide to." Chloe wiped her eyes quickly, managing a small, unsteady smile. "For what it's worth, I hope you get everything sorted out. You deserve that." "Thank you," Vivian said, and meant it. Vivian stepped further down the hallway, needing air, needing a moment away from the weight of the room. That was when she saw her. Standing near the far end of the hallway, silver hair pulled back neatly, wearing a simple gray cardigan, stood a woman Vivian would have recognized anywhere, in any hallway, in any lifetime. Grandma Loretta Callahan turned a warm, steady smile spreading across her face. "I told you I'd come if it mattered enough," she said, opening her arms. Vivian crossed the hallway quickly, pulling her grandmother into a tight hug, feeling, for the first time in 2 exhausting weeks, something in her chest finally ease. "How did you even know the hearing was today?" "Dolores called me last night," Loretta said, pulling back to look at her granddaughter carefully. "She thought you could use family in the room, even if it was only in the hallway outside it." "I'm so glad you're here," Vivian said quietly. "So am I," Loretta said. "Though I suspect from what Dolores told me you handled most of this beautifully without me." Nearby Officer Douglas had stepped out for a brief moment as well, coffee in hand, when his eyes landed on the older woman standing beside Vivian. He stopped walking entirely. Loretta Callahan. Loretta turned, studying him for a long moment, recognition slowly dawning across her face. "Hank Douglas," she said slowly. "Well, I'll be... I haven't seen you since you were, 23 years old? Sitting in the back row of my church basement with 2 left feet." Hank laughed a genuine, surprised sound. "You remember that?" "I remember every student who ever showed up to that basement, Hank," Loretta said warmly, "especially the young officer who came in uniform on his lunch break because he was too embarrassed to admit a rookie cop needed lessons in how to properly break a wrist lock." "In my defense, you were terrifying," Hank said, grinning now, years falling away from his face as easily as if it had happened last week instead of decades ago. "I was thorough," Loretta corrected, smiling. Vivian looked between them, stunned. "Wait, you two know each other?" "Your grandmother taught half the Fairbridge police force everything they know about de-escalation and proper restraint techniques," Hank said, shaking his head slowly, clearly still processing the coincidence. "Back before most of your professors were even born, probably." "I had no idea," Vivian said softly. "There's a lot you don't know about those years, sweetheart," Loretta said gently. "Dolores's Walt used to bring officers by every few months, said a police force that only knew how to escalate a situation wasn't much of a force at all." "Walt Whitmore," Hank said, something softening in him at the name. "Good man. Best training officer I ever had, and he wasn't even the one running the class. He just knew who was." "He always said the same thing," Loretta added, that the strongest hands in any room belong to the people patient enough not to need them. Vivian felt something settle deeper in her chest, the pieces of a town she'd only known for a few short months quietly rearranging themselves into something far more connected than she'd realized. It's a small world, Loretta said again, echoing what she'd told Vivian over the phone just days earlier. Smaller than people realize. Hank's expression grew more serious, though warmth still lingered behind his eyes. Your granddaughter handled herself with more restraint and precision that night from what I saw in that video than most fully trained officers manage under half that pressure, he said. You should be proud. I am, Loretta said simply, looking at Vivian with an expression that needed no further words. I always have been. The panel reconvened 20 minutes later, the small conference room noticeably tenser than before. Dean Whitfield stood as everyone settled back into their seats, a stack of papers in front of him. After reviewing all available evidence, he began, his voice carrying a weight and clarity absent from their first meeting. This panel finds that Miss Callahan acted in reasonable self-defense following repeated and documented attempts to de-escalate the situation. The suspension against her is hereby lifted immediately, with a formal notation added to her file clarifying she was the victim, not the aggressor, in this incident. A quiet exhale seemed to move through the room. Regarding Mr. Colby, Whitfield continued, his tone hardening. Given the evidence presented today, including his own recorded statements, along with 2 previous unresolved complaints of similar behavior, this panel is recommending immediate suspension from Maplewood University, pending a full disciplinary review that may result in expulsion. Preston's mother made a small strangled sound. His father sat rigid, saying nothing. Additionally, Whitfield added, his eyes briefly meeting Hank's across the room, given the football program's athletic scholarship requirements include a clean conduct record, Mr. Colby's scholarship status will be reviewed immediately by the athletics department. Preston sat frozen, staring straight ahead, the full weight of consequence finally, unavoidably settling over him. Dean Whitfield turned finally toward Wesley and Grady, both sitting rigid in their seats. Given your statements corroborating the footage and your cooperation once approached, no further disciplinary action will be taken against either of you at this time, he said. I would encourage you both to reflect carefully on the choices that led you into that hallway in the first place. Wesley nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly, relief and shame mixing openly on his face. Grady simply stared down at his hands, silent. This hearing is adjourned, Dean Whitfield said finally. Outside in the hallway, news of the outcome spread quickly through the small crowd of students who had gathered, waiting anxiously for word. Priya was there, along with Elliot, along with a handful of others who had quietly followed the situation over the past 2 weeks. When Vivian stepped out of the conference room, a small, spontaneous round of applause broke out among them, quiet but genuine. Vivian felt her cheeks flush slightly, unused to this kind of attention, though something warm settled in her chest nonetheless. Elliot approached first, looking somewhere between relieved and nervous. I should have come forward sooner, he said quietly. I'm sorry it took me so long. You came forward? Vivian said simply. That's what mattered. Elliot nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Priya squeezed Vivian's arm briefly. For what it's worth, I'm really glad this ended the way it did. Me too, Vivian said, meaning it more than she could easily put into words. Loretta stood a little further back, letting the younger students have their moment, watching her granddaughter with quiet, unmistakable pride. Dolores had come too, arriving just before the recess ended, unable to stay away once she'd heard the hearing was finally underway. She wrapped Vivian in a tight hug the moment there was space to do so. I never doubted you for a second, honey, she said. Not once. Thank you for being here, Vivian said, hugging her back. Wouldn't have missed it, Dolores said, wiping her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. Now go on. Let people be happy for you. You've earned it. Across the hallway, Preston walked out with his parents, his father already speaking in low-clipped tones about lawyers and appeals, though even Preston seemed to understand from the hollow look on his face that something larger than a scholarship had already been lost. As he passed Vivian in the hallway, he slowed just briefly. I didn't think you'd actually fight back, he said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes. I thought you'd just take it, like everybody else always does. I know, Vivian said. That was the problem. Preston opened his mouth as though to say something else, then simply nodded once and kept walking, his father's hand firm on his shoulder as they disappeared down the hallway. Vivian watched him go, feeling not triumph exactly, but something quieter, something closer to closure. That evening, Vivian and Loretta walked slowly across campus together, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the quad, students moving past them in every direction, none of them aware of everything that had just quietly shifted in the small conference room behind them. "You're staying the night?" Vivian asked. "If you'll have me," Loretta said. "I already told Sam I'd take the extra bed and let her have the couch in the lounge downstairs." She seemed thrilled at the idea, honestly. Vivian laughed softly. "She probably wants to ask you 100 questions about the church basement." "She's welcome to," Loretta said. "It's not a secret. It never was. I just never had a reason to bring it up here until now." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the campus settling into its usual evening rhythm around them. "I'm proud of you, you know," Loretta said eventually. "Not for winning, for how you handled all of it, start to finish." "I almost gave up a few times," Vivian admitted. "Almost withdrew, almost just let them win by disappearing quietly. But you didn't," Loretta said simply. "That's the part that matters." Vivian nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the last few weeks finally beginning to lift just slightly with every step across the quiet, golden campus. Preston Colby left Maplewood University 2 weeks later, his scholarship formally revoked, his enrollment suspended pending the outcome of the disciplinary review that would ultimately end in expulsion. He did not leave quietly, at least not at first. There were angry phone calls from his father to the athletic department, a brief unsuccessful attempt to appeal the decision, a flurry of rumors that came and went across campus the way rumors always did. But 3 weeks after he left, an envelope arrived at the wagon wheel addressed simply to Dolores. Inside was a short, handwritten note. "Dolores, I'm sorry for how I treated you. You didn't deserve any of it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know I understand that now, even if it took losing something to finally see it. Preston." Dolores read it twice, sitting quietly at the counter after closing, before folding it carefully and tucking it behind the old photograph of Walt she kept near the register. She never showed it to anyone but Vivian, and only once, a few weeks later, over a slow Tuesday shift. "Doesn't undo anything," Dolores said, studying the note thoughtfully. "But it's something. More than most folks manage when they've been given every excuse in the world not to look at themselves honestly." "Do you think he meant it?" Vivian asked. "I think," Dolores said slowly, "some people only learn certain lessons the hard way. The important thing isn't whether the lesson came easy, it's whether they let it change them once it finally arrived." Vivian thought about that for a long time afterward, about restraint and consequence and the strange, quiet possibility that even the person who had caused her the most harm might somewhere down the road become someone slightly better because of it. She didn't need him to. But she found somewhat to her own surprise that she hoped it anyway. 2 days after the hearing itself, Dolores insisted on hosting a small gathering at the wagon wheel after closing hours. Just a little something, she called it. Though by the time Vivian arrived, half the booths were filled with familiar faces. Sam was there, along with Priya and Elliot. Wesley showed up briefly too, standing awkwardly near the door, until Dolores personally waved him inside with a slice of pie, telling him everyone deserved a second chance to make better choices, including him. "I wasn't sure I should come," Wesley admitted quietly, sliding into a booth near the back, away from the main cluster of noise. "You told the truth when it counted," Vivian said, sitting across from him. "That's why you're here." Wesley turned his fork over slowly in his hands. "I keep thinking about how easy it would have been to just stay quiet. Preston's been my friend since middle school. Speaking up against him felt like betraying something, even though I knew it was the right thing to do." "Doing the right thing usually feels like that at first," Vivian said. "Usually." My grandmother says the easy choice and the right choice are rarely the same choice. If they were, more people would make it. Wesley managed a small, tired smile. Your grandmother sounds like she's got a saying for everything. Pretty much, Vivian said, smiling back. Across the diner, Officer Hank Douglas arrived in plain clothes, looking more relaxed than Vivian had ever seen him, laughing easily with Loretta over coffee near the counter, old stories from a church basement resurfacing between them like they'd never lost touch at all. Tell her about the time you tried to arrest the heavy bag, Loretta said, grinning at Dolores, who nearly dropped the pot of coffee she was holding from laughing. That happened exactly once, Hank said, feigning wounded dignity, and I was 23. It happened twice, Loretta corrected. I was there both times. The whole counter erupted into laughter, warm and easy, the kind of laughter that only exists among people who have decided, without ever quite saying so out loud, to trust one another completely. Vivian sat quietly near the window for a while, watching the small, warm scene unfold around her, feeling something settle deep in her chest that she hadn't fully expected. Loretta found her there, eventually sliding into the booth across from her granddaughter. You've been quiet tonight, she said gently. Quieter than usual, even for you. Vivian considered her words carefully before speaking. I keep thinking about something, she said. Why I didn't fight back sooner. Before that night in the hallway. You mean the diner, the classroom, all the smaller moments before it? Vivian nodded. I could have handled a lot of it differently, she said, sooner. I had the ability the whole time. Loretta was quiet for a moment, studying her granddaughter carefully. Do you remember the promise you made me the summer you turned 12? She asked. Vivian nodded slowly. Only when there's no other choice left. That's right, Loretta said. I didn't teach you restraint because I doubted your strength, Vivian. I taught you restraint because strength without it just becomes another kind of bullying, no matter how justified it feels in the moment. So I was right to wait. You were right to try every other option first, Loretta said. Words, distance, patience. You gave this situation every chance to resolve itself without your hands ever needing to be involved. That's not weakness. That's exactly the kind of strength I always hoped you'd carry. Vivian felt something in her chest finally loosen, a tension she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying since that first night in the hallway. I was scared, she admitted quietly. Not of fighting, of what people would think of me once they knew. And now they know, Loretta said gently. And look around this room, Vivian. Look at what they think of you now. Vivian looked around the small, crowded diner, at Sam, laughing with Priya near the counter, at Elliot, talking quietly with Wesley near the door, at Hank and Dolores, sharing old stories over coffee, at her grandmother, sitting across from her, steady and warm, as she had always been. I think, Vivian said slowly, they think I did the right thing. I think so too, Loretta said, reaching across the table to squeeze her granddaughter's hand. Back on campus, the weeks following the hearing brought quieter, less visible changes, the kind that rarely made headlines but mattered all the same. Dean Whitfield requested a meeting with Vivian and Officer Douglas together, 2 weeks after the hearing concluded, in the same conference room where everything had come to light. I want to be honest with you both, he said, folding his hands on the table in front of him. I didn't handle this the way I should have from the beginning. I let certain considerations weigh more heavily than they should have, and a student nearly paid the price for that. Why are you telling us this? Vivian asked, not unkindly, simply curious. Because I'm implementing changes, Whitfield said. Starting next semester, all conduct investigations involving conflicting witness statements will require a minimum 48-hour evidence-gathering period before any disciplinary action is issued. No more decisions made in a single afternoon based on a single account. He looked at Hank. And I'd like to formally request that campus security be included earlier in any future investigations, not brought in after the fact. Hank nodded slowly, clearly approving. That's a good start. It's a start, Whitfield agreed. I can't undo what almost happened here, but I intend to make sure it's harder for it to happen again to anyone. Vivian left that meeting feeling something she hadn't expected to feel toward the man who had once threatened her education over a hallway she never wanted to be part of. Something close to respect. 3 weeks later, Vivian stood in the same basement gym she had used quietly alone since her very first week at Maplewood. Except tonight the room wasn't empty. 6 students stood in a loose row facing her borrowed mats spread across the floor. A small hand-painted sign taped to the door that read, "Women's Self-Defense Free Class, Tuesdays and Thursdays." Priya stood in the front row along with Sam, along with a few other students who had reached out quietly over the past few weeks, asking if Vivian might be willing to teach them even a little of what she knew. Vivian had hesitated at first. Then she had called her grandmother asking for advice. "Teach them exactly what I taught you," Loretta had said simply. "Patience first, strength second, and remind them often that both matter equally." Standing now in front of 6 nervous, hopeful faces, Vivian felt something settle into place, something that had been missing since she first arrived on campus, quiet and unsure, carrying 10 years of training nobody around her had ever known about. "Okay," she said, her voice steady, carrying easily across the small room. "Let's start with something simple. A block. It won't look like much at first." She demonstrated, slowly, precisely, the same motion her grandmother had corrected 40 times in a sunny backyard 11 years earlier. "But if you practice it enough," Vivian continued, "your body will know exactly what to do long before your fear ever gets the chance to argue with it." The students practiced the motion together, slow and unsteady at first, exactly the way Vivian remembered being. She moved between them patiently, adjusting an elbow here, a stance there, offering quiet encouragement, the same steady, patient voice her grandmother had once used with her. Near the back of the small group, Elliot stood, watching from the doorway, having offered to help set up chairs and mats before the first class began. "You're good at this," he said, once the students had settled into a break, stretching tired arms and comparing notes on their stances. "I had a good teacher," Vivian said simply. "I meant the teaching part," Elliot said, "not just the karate. You're patient with them. That's not something everyone has." Vivian considered that for a moment. "I think patience is just something you learn, the same way you learn a block or a strike." "Nobody's born with it. You practice it over and over until it becomes part of how you move through the world." Elliot smiled slightly. "Guess I've got some practicing to do myself then." "We all do," Vivian said. "That's kind of the point." Priya wandered over during the same break, rolling one shoulder gingerly, a proud sort of grimace on her face. "I'm going to feel this tomorrow," she said. "Worth it, though. I've spent 19 years assuming I'd just have to run if something ever happened. Turns out, running isn't actually the only option." "It's a good option, too," Vivian said, "just not the only one." "Duly noted," Priya said, grinning, before heading back to rejoin the others. The class resumed a moment later, and by the time it ended, most of the students were laughing quietly among themselves, comparing sore muscles, already asking when the next session would begin. Vivian walked back to her dorm alone that night, the campus quiet around her, streetlights humming softly overhead. She thought about the girl who had arrived on this campus months earlier, quiet and guarded, keeping a decade of discipline folded carefully out of sight, afraid of what people might think if they ever saw the whole of her. She thought about how much had changed since then, not because she had become someone different, but because she had finally let people see who she had been all along. That night before bed, she opened her notebook one more time, the same one she had written in months earlier, back when everything with Preston had still felt uncertain and heavy. She uncapped her pen and wrote slowly. "I used to think being quiet meant being invisible. I don't think that anymore. Quiet was never the same as invisible. It was just where I kept everything that mattered until the world was finally ready to see it." 6 students showed up tonight to learn something my grandmother taught me 11 years ago in a backyard in Fairbridge. I think that's how good things actually spread. Not loudly, just patiently, one person teaching another one steady hand at a time. I hope wherever this goes next, I remember to stay exactly that patient. She closed the notebook, turned off her lamp, and looked once more at the small photo on her desk before closing her eyes. The little girl in the white uniform, the steady hands resting on her shoulders. Some lessons she had learned took 10 years to fully understand. Others took only one difficult semester and a hallway she never wanted to walk into to finally make sense of completely. She thought just before sleep finally took her that both kinds of lessons had led her to exactly the same place. A quiet room, a handful of steady hands, a patience that no longer felt like waiting but like something closer to home. Word of the self-defense class spread faster than Vivian had expected, faster than she'd dared to hope it might. By the second week, the sign on the basement door had been updated twice more. Names added beneath the original 6, a waiting list forming for a room that could barely hold 12 people comfortably. Sam took it upon herself to make a proper flyer, bright and hand-lettered, taping copies to bulletin boards across every dorm on campus without asking anyone's permission first. "You're going to need a bigger room," Sam told her one evening, surveying the growing stack of sign-up sheets on Vivian's desk. "Or a second night, or possibly a small army of assistant instructors." "One thing at a time," Vivian said, though she couldn't quite keep the smile out of her voice. Dean Whitfield, hearing about the class through campus channels, offered the use of a larger room in the recreation center, free of charge, along with proper mats donated by the athletic department. A small gesture that Vivian suspected was part apology, part genuine change of heart, and didn't much mind which. By the time the semester ended, the Tuesday and Thursday class had grown to nearly 30 students. Women who had never once considered learning to defend themselves, standing shoulder to shoulder in a room that had once been empty except for a girl who trained alone in the dark, telling no one why. Outside the small basement window, evening settled gently over Maplewood University campus, lights flickering on one by one across the quiet, ordinary quad. Nobody walking past that basement window that first evening would have known what was happening quietly inside it. A quiet girl, once mocked for her silence, was teaching 6 new students that strength didn't require a loud voice to be real. It simply required someone patient enough to practice it, one small, steady motion at a time, until the day it mattered most. And somewhere in a small town not so far away, an older woman with silver hair and steady hands smiled to herself, knowing exactly what her granddaughter had just begun. The lesson, after all, had never really been about winning a single hallway. It had always been about becoming someone worth being, quietly, patiently, one practiced motion at a time, long before anyone else was watching closely enough to notice.